Hi, welcome to the Amy Noel on Dyslexia YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be talking about auditory processing disorder and its link with dyslexia. This is a channel for parents and caregivers and educators of kids with dyslexia. There's not a lot out there, especially on YouTube, about the link between auditory processing disorder and dyslexia. There was one video that I saw with Martha Burns, and I will refer to it later. I did a lot of research for this video, so I'm going to be referring to my notes. Auditory processing disorder is sometimes called CAPD, Central Auditory Processing Disorder. So sometimes a lot of C, it's the same thing. Auditory processing disorder may cause dyslexia because it often leads to problems with phonological processing. There were two studies that Martha Burns cited in her video. The first one she mentioned was by Bart Boats, and his colleagues were looking at identifying auditory processing disorders in children who were entering kindergarten and in the first early years of school, and then following them to see what kinds of learning issues resulted over time. It was a very interesting longitudinal study where he found that when children have auditory processing disorders in kindergarten, they're very likely to be diagnosed with dyslexia by grade 3. The other study that she cited was Terri, Bellis, and another group of researchers. It was published in the Journal of American Speech and Hearing Association, and it looked at the relationship between auditory processing disorders and reading disorders. And they found that if you look at children who are having reading problems and you test their auditory processing, you can see several different dimensions of auditory processing that seem to be problematic in those children. So we see this link, and it makes me kind of wonder, like, are we calling kids with auditory processing disorder dyslexic or vice versa? They are two distinct things, so we need to kind of look at what the difference is. Dyslexia is defined by Sally Shaywitz as an unexpected difficulty in reading for an individual who has the intelligence to be a much better reader. It's most commonly caused by a difficulty in phonological processing, the appreciation of individual sounds of spoken language, which affects the ability of an individual to speak, read, and spell. You can see my video all about what dyslexia is. It's more than just phonological processing. It's also rapid naming, sequencing issues. But sequencing is also an issue with auditory processing disorder, as well as memory issues. Auditory processing disorder is not a problem with your hearing, but a problem with processing the sounds. So you'll have a perfect hearing test, but then for some reason you don't understand or remember the things that you heard. Auditory processing has to do with auditory memory, auditory discrimination. I have a long list of symptoms for auditory processing to help you understand it better. Issues with auditory discrimination: the ability to hear differences in separate sounds such as B and D and I and eh. So that's auditory discrimination. Then there's also issues with auditory ground discrimination, which is the inability to precisely hear what is being spoken due to background noise. Auditory memory issues: remembering accurately stating the order in which the words and or sounds occurred. Like maybe you or your child would inaccurately repeat back a story. Auditory sequencing: the ability to properly order language sounds in words or sentences. For example, a child may reverse the units of sound so that when they say the word animal, it comes out aminal. I saw that a lot with two of my sons, and that's something that I thought was a symptom of dyslexia, and maybe it is. Okay, segmenting: the ability to break a word into individual sounds or phonemes. This I find is so hard for people with dyslexia to pull apart a word, right? But it's a symptom of auditory processing disorder as well. Auditory synthesis or auditory blending, which is the inability to pull together individual sounds to form words. So it's like the opposite of segmenting. And auditory closure: the inability to fill in any missing sounds to decode a word. For example, this may involve understanding what someone with a foreign accent may be saying when they delete a sound or two in a word. And the inability to follow a musical or poetic rhythm, like stressed and unstressed syllables. Here's a list of symptoms of auditory processing disorder in adults. You have difficulty finding your way around town. When you leave your grocery list at home, you're mystified as to what was on it. After meeting people at a cocktail party, you can't remember any of their names. In elementary school, you lagged behind the other kids in language arts, even though you were great at math. You have difficulty remembering and following multi-step directions. When coworkers speak to you in busy places like the cafeteria, you may have trouble clearly understanding. Sometimes you make silly or careless mistakes, like adding instead of subtracting. Often you don't notice your phone is ringing and miss important calls. You have trouble discerning if your boss is angry with you when she calls you in for a meeting. Spell check is your best friend. One of the sources I used to research for this said that it can be diagnosed usually earlier than dyslexia because it doesn't require reading to test. It can often be diagnosed at age 6 or 7. As with everything else, if you treat it early, that is the best early intervention. A neuropsychologist is what I recommend people go to because they will look at everything, across the gamut. My kids got tested by a school psychologist because we didn't want to pay for a neuropsychologist. And they do what's called the TAPS test. So if your child has an IEP, they've had a school evaluation, look on there for the TAPS test. That's the Auditory Processing test. And I looked at my kids' scores to see what they've been over the years. My son Jacob, in 2014, when he was in kindergarten, he got great scores. His overall was a 94 per TAPS. So that's average. And then 2017, he scored low with 78. And then in 2020, it was in the 80s, so low average. Michael in 2017 had excellent scores, and then in 2020, it was his qualifying disability. I think maybe part of why my kids' scores went down as they got older is because the phonological processing became more of an issue. With the TAPS test, part of it is phonological processing. And if your child has dyslexia, they may score really low in phonological processing, even though the other areas of the TAPS test they can score high in. And then in 2021, it was low average. And he did fail the Barton screener for auditory processing, which I have a link to in the description. And he did foundation and sounds with his Barton tutor. So the tutor gave him the screener and then said, okay, he's not ready to do Barton because we have to treat his auditory processing disorder first. And that's one thing I wanted to point out, is that before you can really work with a child on dyslexia, you need to address the auditory processing issues. And then Jefferson, he qualified under phonological processing. My son Jefferson also failed the Barton screening and did foundation and sounds, and Daniel did as well. And I did the foundation and sounds with him just halfway. Then I gave him the screener again and he passed it, so we moved on. Right now with Daniel, I'm doing Dr. David Kilpatrick's Equipped for Reading Success 1-minute exercises every day. Like, I do them maybe 4 or 5 times a week. We're pretty good about doing his tutoring. That helps him with auditory discrimination and manipulations. So most of the sources that I looked into said to treat auditory processing, you need auditory discrimination task, and speech therapy is often recommended as well. I'm assuming if you're watching this video, your child probably also has reading issues. So I think if they have dyslexia as well, it's a good idea to go with a program or a treatment that incorporates auditory discrimination tasks with reading skills, something that's not specifically for auditory processing, but for both. Lindamood phonemic sequencing, or LIPS, is a reading program that's also designed for auditory processing disorder. It's expensive, but if you can afford it, I think it would be amazing. I set up this channel hoping that I could give people free ways to help their kids, but I ended up learning that the best way to help my kid has been with a program. I mean, I used foundation and sounds because that's what we could afford. We couldn't afford LIPS. And now we're doing all about reading with Daniel. I've heard people say it's worth going into debt for, but I'm so anti-debt that I wouldn't do that. But I guess, I don't know, if I had to, maybe I would. There is a link in the description for some auditory discrimination activities that you can do at home for free. It was a resource that I found. There's also links for LIPS, foundation and sounds, gym learning, which I don't know anything about, but it's for auditory processing, and Dr. David Kilpatrick's Equipped for Reading Success. Besides APD programs, it's helpful to keep some things in mind. 7 things I wish people knew about parenting a child with auditory processing disorder. Number 1, he isn't being defiant. With APD, the brain doesn't always process spoken words smoothly, so when my son doesn't respond right away or doesn't understand what I'm saying, he's not doing it to be rude or defiant. He simply didn't comprehend. Number 2, the link between APD and hearing can be confusing. Having APD isn't the same as being hard of hearing. Number 3, competing sounds and noises make understanding harder. Number 4, telling him to pay closer attention or listen harder doesn't help, and that's true for ADHD too. Number 5, rephrasing is more helpful than repeating. When my son responds with "what" to something I said, it's tempting to repeat exactly what I said in a louder voice, but what he really needs is for me to say what I said in a different way. Number 6, he wants to feel safe to ask you to say something as many times as he needs. And number 7, it's okay to be frustrated as long as you try to understand. In conclusion, it's important to remember that neurodiversities often overlap, like ADHD, APD, dyslexia, depression, anxiety, and these will happen in varying degrees. So they may be way more dyslexic than they are APD, but it can be helpful to look into all of them so that you can know what to do for them. I hope this video was helpful. Please leave any comments below if you have information to add or to correct if I misstated, which I wouldn't doubt. Like, I'm not an expert, okay? I'm just a busy mom and I barely had time to make this video. Bye.